This is a film about moorland natural flood management in Roeburndale. So we'll first look at what the damage is that's occurring up on the tops. So in some areas there's damage to the blanket bog. So this is a damaged blanket bog where there would have been heather and sphagnum mosses. But now there's areas of bare peat. These could have been caused by heather beetle, they could have been caused by overgrazing when there was a headage subsidy, but they all lead to a faster runoff off this area. Another thing that was happened in here is in the 1950s, after the war, there was a whole drainage system put in to make this area more fertile, but what that's led to is much faster runoff. Going higher up on the fell, there's still fast runoff from this area. And up on Goodber Common, there's some of these peat hags, which again erode the peat, and if they're not protected, they'll keep on eroding peat for years to come. Some areas also, where there's water running over the surface into the clay, they've led to a landslip. This is an area of Whitmore where the water is cutting through the peat. The area above here was showing almost as bare rock in the early 1960s aerial photographs. When this drops down this little waterfall, it's at the top of a gully. This is eroding the peat away. The banks slip in, and over time it's just ended up with a very deep, long gully. This is called Warmbeck. One of the things with this, because it's Warmbeck, it's facing south, so all these dark coloured areas heat up more, and when they heat up they repel water much quicker. It's like having a pan, and when it gets hot, the hot water rushes off, and that's the same with this sort of landscape. Further up, this is on Mallardale Fell, you can see this pattern that's like a blood vessel pattern that shows the gullies that occur in the landscape. So this shows up well on an aerial photograph. What's happened in this area, and a bit higher than this, so higher up here, is there was a fire in the 1940s, and this fire led to a lot of damage to the peat and the heather and the sphagnum mosses. And what's happened in this area is that instead of those, you've got grasses, sweeter grasses coming in, and the sweeter grasses attract the sheep, so the grazing pressure is more on this area, and those sweeter grasses don't have the roughness of heather, and leads to a lot more erosion. So this is the area where the start of the Ray flood occurred in 1967. A big rush off on here, 120 millimetres in 90 minutes, led to the start of Ray flood. And as the flood came down, this is on Mallardale Bridge, it washed away the bridge going to the farm. Further down at Barking Bridge, it dropped a lot of trees on the bridge. As it went further on down, it picked up more trees. Those trees damaged Backsbottom Farm, destroyed most of the farm. Then it moved down to Ray. In Ray there were 13 houses that had to be destroyed after the flood. And then further on down it deposited the debris of trees and furniture further down the valley. So this is a peak flood. So this is a hydrograph of flood Desmond. So here we have a low level of water, then a sudden peak, and the sudden peak lasts for a fairly short time, then drops down rapidly. So with flood management, what we want to try and do is take that peak away. And by taking the peak away, so we can stop the fast runoff, then we can have a much longer period when the river is up, but it never comes up as high and never causes the same amount of damage. In Roeburndale, when there's a rainfall of over 50 millimetres, that tends to cause bank erosion. One of the things we're seeing now is change in the climate. We're seeing frequency of flooding. Up to 2014 there was an average bankful flood once in every 2 years. Since 2015 there have been 2 to 3 floods per year. We've also had the opposite effect with streams drying up. The last 3 years we've had streams that have dried up that haven't dried up before that. The UK climate change suggests that there's a greater chance of hotter, drier summers, somewhere between 41 and 57% drier, and warmer and wetter winters, 20 to 33% wetter by the year 2070. So we're looking at a change to a wetter and drier future. So what are the benefits of putting in natural flood management? Who does it benefit? Farmers will benefit from reduced loss of soil and peat by reducing the flash flooding off the land. There'll be less landslips, less gullies, less damage to fencing. With each gully and landslip, nutrients are pulled out of the land and get washed down the river. So that's a loss of fertility. So it's important that we actually, if we can hold the water in the landscape. And also in the future, under the countryside stewardship or in the environmental land management scheme, farmers will be able to receive a payment for this work and for increases in biodiversity. Further downstream, because of the slowing of the flood down, there'll be less damage to Ray, Hornby and Lancaster, the downstream communities. But also important in the river itself, because of the reduced amount of peat which gets into, when it gets into the river, it acidifies the river, it deoxygenates the river, and you get a reduction in invertebrates. So that affects the fish and the birds, such as the dipper. That's part of our heritage. So in the long term, it will help us bring back a thriving fish stock to our river, and maybe even bring back things like the kingfisher and the otters to the river. So how can we deal with the bare peat areas? In the Peat District, they've worked with reprofiling peat hags, so that's reducing the slope on the peat hags, and then they've revegetated them. In some places they've planted grasses, adding a bit of fertiliser to get the grasses going to give it a first cover, and then they put Eriophorum, the cotton grass, planted that in to give a good natural cover to the bases. They've held the water back in areas using heather bales. They've used some plastic check dams. They've used timber check dams, and they've used stone check dams to hold the flow back. In the Forest of Bowland, the Abbeystead estate has been working on the tops in the Forest of Bowland, and there they've put in these wooden check dams, ways to slow the flow from the peat, try and stop the peat erosion. On Whitmore, in Roeburndale, I've worked with using some check dams. With check dams, the wider the area behind the check dam, the more water that can be held back. So it's important to measure, really to look at the height of the check dam, and then to go back with I use a laser level to try and find out how much land is covered and get some idea of how many cubic metres of water are held back by the check dam. With check dams, it's important that they're leaky. So at the base of the check dam, we need to make sure there's enough gap there to let the normal flow of water through, so it doesn't restrict normal flow, and all the wildlife that moves up and down the stream is unaffected. When there's a drainage ditch, can we slow that down? So one of the things I've done there is put in a piece of a log, an older log, and put in a number of those, but the top of the log is at the level with so that when it's all full, it holds water back all level rather than going down a slope, and that way it stops the erosion. And over time this has built up and built the sphagnum moss to cover over the whole area. So again, it holds the water, but it still lets it drain down the ditch. Another area where there's been quite a lot of work is in T-Bay Common. There they put in about 150 check dams that really hold the water back there and stop the flooding down below. On part of Whitmore, the blanket bog has been restored. This has been done by just having reduced grazing pressure. It's taken about 15 years to bring it back. One of the aspects of blanket bog that's really important is that it holds water. So it can hold something like 70% of its volume in water. So where you get this tussocks, so here we've got sphagnum mosses, we've got some bilberries, we've got some heather, there's cross-leaved heath, there's cranberry here. So any water flowing over it is slowed down, and also because it absorbs a lot of water. Because it's in here, it's quite cool, and because of the coolness, that helps the water sink into the earth. Water becomes more and more dense as it goes towards 4 degrees centigrade. So the cooler you can get it, the more dense it becomes and the more likely it is to filter into the ground. So it can put the water where we need it, which is underneath the ground, not running over the surface. On the upland areas in Roeburndale, much of it is used for grouse shooting. Part of the grouse shooting and management, there's heather burning on a rotational basis. So this burns off the tall heathers and you get a young regrowth of the heathers that's good for a grouse feed. What tends to happen with this rotational burning is that you get, in the first 3 years, you get suppressed cotton grass and sphagnum mosses. Then before the heather has grown tall, the sphagnum mosses grow into abundance. Then after about 10 years, the heather gets tall and leggy, it reduces the light and suppresses the sphagnum. When it gets to that stage, it's also because it's tall and leggy, it becomes much more prone to fire hazard. So wildfires will go through it, burn a lot hotter and get into the peat. So some of the management techniques, if it's going to be used for grouse, then using cattle grazing, light cattle grazing, can help break up the taller heather tussocks and let the light in to let the sphagnum mosses come back in. So using upland breeds of cattle can be quite successful with this. The other technique is really to take it back by re-wetting. And by re-wetting, it gets it back into an area where the sphagnum thrives. The heather doesn't really get too tall. It doesn't become a fire hazard, but it gets the diversity of the blanket bog. So that's really what we're aiming for in the natural flood management situation, where we've got big tussocks of sphagnum that hold a lot of water and protect it by keeping the whole area moist for a longer period of time. This is a ditch on the farm that we've brought it into here. We've made a small earth dam here to hold the water back. So we've done that in a few places along. When it comes round the edge of the dam. When it's come round the corner, in normal flow, the water goes underneath the log. When it's in full flood, this area floods over, so it runs alongside the log, alongside the next log, and then into the swale. Although the swale is very dry at the moment. But often in dry conditions is when there's a problem up on the fell, because when it's very dry, no water sinks into the ground, so it all runs off. So if we've got a heavy rain now, and it would run over the surface very quickly. So actually by putting these swales in, it would capture something like 70% of all the rainwater, and then the trees alongside it. The trees are there because their root systems help absorb the water down into the ground, and then the water is held underground. So the whole purpose of the swale is to slow, spread and sink the water. Trees that have worked well on this area are the birch, and the rowan is another one that works well in this area. This swale is holding water, and you can see the sphagnum moss is growing in the bottom of it. The other thing this has is it's really good habitat for newts and for dragonflies. So we see a lot of things and water boatmen in this area. And because this is wetland, up on the fells, it's also good feeding ground for the curlews, the lapwings and the wading birds. It's important to realise that we're not talking about making the fields wetter, we're talking about sinking that water into the ground. So it's not about creating, farmers may think we're talking about actually trying to make the fields wetter, we're talking about it getting the water down below where it should be. When it's down lower into the ground, in dry times, like we've got at the moment, that water will be held in the ground and will help the plants keep growing. One aspect of upland management regarding the water management is working in cooperation. The more farmers that get together, the more can be achieved. Up in the T-Bay Valley, a lot of the farmers have got to get together there. They put in 150 check dams that have really helped stop the flooding in an area up there. Under the new ELM scheme, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, there's going to be additional funding for groups working together. So I think it's now time for farmers to get together to work out what the priorities are, how they're going to help the communities outside their farm, because everyone can actually benefit from the way we farm. And with the ELM scheme, the government supports farmers to give these environmental benefits and social benefits. We can still farm profitably, in some cases where we actually reduce the number of stock, although it may appear that you'd lose money, but many farmers are actually finding when they reduce the stocking, they end up with more income coming in. One farmer reduced his sheep from 600 to 200, and he went from getting 25 pence per head effectively, after all the work that went into it, to getting a really good profit on each lamb. It's how we market things, how we put things together, that's really important. So I urge all upland farmers really to see if they can work with neighbours. Traditionally we used to work with neighbours for haymaking, so now we can work with neighbours to sort out a future that has a future, rather than letting the flood waters wash away our lands, or the droughts dry up our land so much so we don't have any fodder in the summer. And that's all to do with the land management higher up the fell. There's work in Slovakia that's actually looking at how, by putting in water retention areas, it changes the microclimate. And by changing the microclimate, they've managed to keep the rainfall into areas that were very dry, because the water evaporates from the ground. When it evaporates, it goes up and it forms clouds that move on in the landscape to put rain down somewhere else, but only a small amount of rain. If you don't have any rain and the ground gets hot and dry, when the clouds build up, there's this dry air flowing up into the atmosphere, and that stops the rain clouds from coming in. So you end up with this situation that we have now, where you're in a high pressure area and really there's nothing coming into the area at all. No clouds. We haven't seen clouds for weeks. And I find that very worrying, because this landscape has relied on rainfall on a fairly regular basis. But now we have the opposite. We have really heavy rain throughout the winter, which is flooding and waterlogging the land, and drier areas in the spring. And it's actually to do with how we manage the land that this is caused. It's not all climate change, it's actually how we look after the land. And how we're looking after the land is affecting the climate. There's an organisation in Slovakia called Rain for Climate, which is working on this aspect.